Welcome to this series on creating applications with React and Redux. I'm going to assume in this series that you know the basics of React. We're going to be focusing on how Redux fits into this picture. If you haven't ever tried any React, go watch some other videos. I have some other videos talking about React. Go check those out before you watch this series. I'm also therefore going to assume you know some basic JavaScript. We're not going to be talking really about CSS or HTML much. I'm going to just assume that you've got some JavaScript down and that you've played with and at least basically familiar with React. Maybe not good at it, but at least you've used it and you know essentially what's going on. So Redux will be our focus. So Redux is a state container for React. It is an attempt to go with the basic idea of a flux flow for data and events. We're going to be talking about that as we go along. It's an abstract concept, and so we'll be bringing in some pictures and whatnot to think through how these things work. These first few videos, we are going to start with bare minimal. We are going to do as little as possible to get React apps built with Redux integrated. And so we're going to be leaving out a number of things that later we will be bringing in. What you would do with a small application is not what you would do with a large application. And with these small applications, Redux is way overkill. But that's okay. We're just going to be starting with Redux and just to get the ideas. And then once you get the idea on the simple, then bring that to the more complex. And as we go through, we'll be bringing in more ideas, more pieces from Redux, as well as talking about more in terms of patterns and whatnot. But for these first few videos, they're going to be very simple and as little as possible that we can do in these applications just to get everything working. So that's where we're going to start. And this is our starter application today. It's a single component that has a value and a button, and you increment the value. And when you increment, it changes the value and therefore the component updates. So let's see how we can build this. Okay, let's get started. So we have an app created, made with Create React App. And I had this open in Atom, and I have a picture, and this is what we're going to be working from. In this app, this describes a very basic Redux flow. And finally, I have my terminal window. The first thing I want to do is I want to install, so npm install Redux, and we want to also install react-redux. Redux is the library for state management. React-redux is something made to make Redux and React stick together. It's a binding library. The idea is you can actually just totally use Redux straight up with React without React-Redux, but it does come with some handy things in it. So we're going to learn to use it. And so we need to install those and give that a sec. Once we get those done, we can go ahead and jump in and start making our counter. All right, let's start with the basic React component. I have my app, it's a bit big. So I have my app here, and I actually don't need most of this stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of it. Don't need the logo. So this should give us a nice blank app to play with. Let's create a new component. It can be in this folder or another. We'll call this the counter. We're going to start with making this a pure functional component. This could just as well be a class-based component. It doesn't really matter, but we are actually taking we're taking the state out of the components, and we're also taking the event handlers out of the components and feeding them in through props. That's where we're ultimately going to go. So I'm just going to create this as a pure functional component. So function counter, and this will take props. And here we're going to return something. Let's right now just get something on the page. Let's make sure everything's working. And that's export default counter. Now if we go to app, we can import counter from that file and put him in. Alright, React must be in scope when using JSX. What I forgot to do is I forgot here at the top that I do need to import React. Alright, there it is. The counter is now rendering. Pretty cool. And so what we're going to do is we're going to need two things. As you saw from the image at the beginning of the video. We're going to need essentially an event handler. We're going to need a function for whenever we click on a button, which means we are going to need the button. We're not going to hook this one up yet. We're just going to focus on the data. And the data is the count. And so that's going to go there. Now both of these are going to come in props. I am going to go ahead and put the count in so we can see that. Right now there's the paragraph, but there's no value here. And the reason why there's no value here is I haven't passed anything in. So now if I pass in something, that's going to basically work. Okay, so here's count 5. Increment doesn't do anything. We're going to do that after we get all the data ultimately flowing. Okay, now that we have our component, it's now time to start talking about Redux. Everything up to this point has been just plain all React. Now we're going to talk Redux. Let's look at our picture. Here's the basic flow. We have our React component over here on the left. What we're going to do is whenever we click on the button that says increment, we're going to create an action, and then we're going to dispatch that action to what's called the store, and the store will run through its reducer. That's here, and that's going to change the state, and that will then update the component. So we've got this one-way flow, and if we hit the increment button again, it's going to create an action, we'll dispatch the action, we will then run the reducer, or Redux will run its reducer, and then the component will re-render. Right? This is the flow we're ultimately going for. Right now, we're just going to focus on setting up the store and that default data. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing we're going to do is now that we have our counter, we're going to import react-redux. And I specifically, I need a specific function here. Because what react-redux does is gives you some basic things that help you glue Redux and React together. And the thing we need is connect. So this connect thing doesn't actually show up in here, but it is going to enable some of these things. And so we're going to import connect from react-redux. So the first thing we want to start with is we need a function that will map anything from the state, which we haven't quite defined yet. We're going to map anything from the state to props. All right, so in this video, we're working from component into the store into the state. In the next video, we'll actually work backwards. We'll actually start with the state and then move towards the component. But in this case, let's do it. Let's create a function. So function map state to props, because that's what it does. It maps the state to the props. So let's see. This is going to take the state, and we're going to return something. And so we're going to take the count from state and put it in a property called count. And so this is what's going to be passed into here. This name right here is actually what shows up in here and then will be used there. So we can see this in action. Let's do a console log and map state to props, and then state. Okay, so that's first thing, we need to create this function, and then what we need to do is we need to use that connect function that we imported at the top, right there. We're going to use that connect function to actually connect this function right here with the component. And what this does is this actually, what we're going to do is we're going to wrap our component with one created by the connect function. So here's how this works. We call connect. We pass in map state to props. And then what we do is we immediately call what comes out of that. And what this does is this creates a new component, not our component, creates a new component, which hooks up this function right here to our component, and then we export it. Now we don't have to change here. As far as this is concerned, this is just the same old counter. It isn't. It's now wrapped in something else. But that's ultimately what's going on here. It's creating a new component and wrapping our component in it and sort of gluing all of these things together. All right, so that's step one. Now if we look here at our website, we're going to see, oh no, bad things happen. Could not find store in either the context or props of connect counter. Either wrap the root component in a provider, which we won't be talking about in this video, or explicitly pass store as a prop to connect counter. And so this is our wrapped component. That's what we will be doing, but that'll be later. What we need to do is we need to get to the next stage. What we've done is we've wrapped our component. The next step is actually to make our store. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in a separate folder. And this isn't a necessary convention. This is how I like to do it. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to create an index.js file. It's in here that we're going to create our store, our Redux store. This is where the reducer lives. If we look at our picture, this is what we're going to be creating up here. And let's actually make this a little bit bigger. All right, so the reducers in the store actually all work together, and so we'll just on the fly improve this little picture right here a little bit. There we go. Okay, so what we're doing is we're working on this yellow box right here. How do we do that? Well, in here we're doing plain old Redux. No react-redux here. This is just regular Redux. And at this point, this distinction isn't going to be clear, but later on it will. So what we need to do is we need to import something from Redux, which is create store. So first thing is we do this. Next thing is we need to define what the state of our application is. So the state of our application is right now just a count variable. Let's actually put a value other than 0 in there. We'll just start off at 3. And so what this object does right here is this sets up the initial or the default state for our application. And then what we do is we need to create something else, and that is a reducer. A reducer is a function. The reducer takes 2 arguments. It's going to take a state, and it's going to take an action. And now that we're just getting started, let's go ahead and let's just return the state at this point. And I'm going to add a console log in here so we know when this happens. Reducer running, and I am going to console log the action so we can see this happen. So this is the basic idea of a reducer. Now for us to use this initial state, we just need to do this. So the first time this is run, there won't be any initial state, and so therefore it'll use this. And so this becomes, on the first running, the state of the application. Any subsequent time, it'll actually be passing in state, which will be changing. This is just a one-time deal right here in the running of the application. And so whenever somebody calls this reducer the first time, the initial state will get copied into here, and then we'll see this run. Now the first one to call this will not be us. It will actually be Redux itself to do that. So now we're going to create the store. We create the store by calling create store, which we imported from Redux, and we pass in our reducer. And then we export default store. And so this is the basic set of steps to create a Redux store. Right now this is, there's actually no way of changing data in here. We'll get to that here in a minute. This is just creating something that starts off with a count, and this is like a basic shell for a store. This is about as basic and to get a basically functional store. So we've got the store, we've exported it. I'm going to go to the app, and I'm going to now import the store from store. And so this import to this folder will grab the index.js and run it automatically. And so this comes here, and now we can finally solve this error. Now let's see how we're doing. Okay, so we have our counter, as we can see, a count of 3. Where does that 3 come from? Well, that comes from right here. Let's change it to something else so we can see that be different. Now it's 8. Okay, so let's look at the flow. What we've done is we've defined our store. We have not dispatched any sort of action. We've also not created any sort of action to dispatch it. But we do have a component that's rendering, and we do have a store. I want to open up the developer tools here and go to the console and see something interesting. Okay, and so we've got our application here that's running. And we have reducer running. That is here in the store. This is our action. All right, and so if we look in here, we can say, okay, what's going on? Maps, well, that's not the one we want to look at. We want to look at this one. So here's the reducer running, and what has been passed in here is an action, and its type is this at redux/net. When I said that something's going to call the reducer this very first time, and that's what's going to set the initial state, and I said Redux was going to do it, that is this, and this is how we know it happened, because we console logged. And this will happen once here when the store is first created. And so when that happens, that then will basically create this initial state. Notice this next console log here. This is map state to props. And so where does that come from? Well, that's from our map state to props function, where the state was passed in, and we map state.count to count here. This being what we're using right here. So if we console log, this is our render. All right, we're going to console log the render props, and let's see this again. So whenever the application starts up, what happens is Redux itself executes an action. It dispatches an action, which runs the reducer in the store. And so here's the action it dispatched. There's that reducer running, and then the app re-renders with the state of count 8. And so then the re-render, the rendering of the component itself happens. And what's in its props? Well, there's that count of 8 right there. There's some other things too, and this is something that react-redux has put in there. This is all we care about right now, and that's this value that came in because we mapped state to props. All right, so that's the flow. Dispatch action, that runs the reducer, and the component re-renders. Now it's our turn to create our own action and then dispatch it so that the reducer can run and we can change the data and therefore have the component updated. So how does that work? Well, this goes, basically at this point, this leads us to creating a new function. And so let's do that. Instead of just mapping state to props, we also need another function called map dispatch to props. Dispatch. Now this dispatch is the dispatcher for Redux. And so here I'm going to return a new object, just like we did before with the props up here. And I'm going to say on increment click. and I want to pass in a function. And what's going to happen here is this is going to come in on the props, like so. And then I can attach it to the button. Let's console log that. And see if we can see it in action. Well, we got this warning, map dispatch to props is defined but never used. So true. We're going to use it in a minute. Okay, so increment. Nothing is happening here. We are going to have to use it, so let's go ahead and bring it in. The map dispatch to props goes right after the map state to props. And now we get rid of the warning, and when we click on this, we can see that that console log is happening. And so what we've done is we've used the map dispatch to props to make events work here. But we still haven't actually entered into this flow yet. We have to now create an action. Well, in Redux, actions are objects. So let's create one. Actions are objects that have a property called type. They can have other properties as well, and that often do, but they must have a type called, they must have a property called type, because this is something that you will use in the reducer to determine what kind of action it actually is. And so we've defined an action right here, gave it a type called increment. That's create action right there. So now let's dispatch it. We got this right here. So now let's see the flow happen. We're going to click on the component. It's going to create an action, dispatch it, and then we're going to see it run in the reducer, if I hooked up everything correctly. All right, so here's our console log, and then sure enough, reducer running, type increment. And so we have an action, we've created it, we dispatch it, and then we come to the reducer, and there it comes in right there. All right, this is reducer running. We have successfully dispatched an action to the reducer. So now that we have an action here, how do we finally close the circle and finish this thing off? Well, what you're doing here is you take this action, you look at the type, and then you decide what you're going to do. So it's common, it's not required, but it's common in these to use switch statements. So I'm going to say action.type. I want to say case increment. Now what I want to do is I want to return a copy of the state. I want to return a brand new state object. For us to do that, we have to either do it manually, or we have to use something that's built into JavaScript that's really fancy, or handy at least, called object assign. Let's do it that way. If you haven't used object assign before, I'll give you a little bit of explanation now, and we'll get to a better explanation later on in another video. And so if we're going to take the object that we have here in the state, which first time through is going to be, what was this? If we're going to take that and make a copy of it, we can do that by doing this. So this first thing I'm passing in is a brand new object, and then the state. So what this will do is this starts off with a new object, and it copies all the values out of here into this new object, and then of course returns it. But just copying the state is not what we want. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass a third object in, and we're going to say the count, the new count is going to be the value of the state count plus 1. And so the way this flows is start with a brand new object, copy all the values out of the state into this brand new object, and then copy all the values out of here. And so count of 8 is going to be copied at this point into the new object, but then we're going to overwrite that with 8 plus 1. So it'll now be a count of 9. And so that's what ultimately gets returned. Now we're about to get a warning. Look, there it is. Expected default case. And so all this is the linter that's looking at the code is just saying, this isn't quite the way I'm expecting to do it. what I want you to do, instead of returning the state down here, is return the state here. And that's all there is for that warning. Okay. Hey, look at that. That actually works. So now that we have this complete, I want to run through the entire flow of the application with our diagram. Okay? So I'm going to refresh the page. We have the reducer running, and the reducer is running because Redux itself has created and dispatched an action, and that action is of type, let's see this type property, Redux init, with the two signs in front of it. So Redux is itself creating and dispatching that action to initialize the store, to get it running. And so when that first action is executed, this reducer runs, and our initial state gets stored in the actual state. And so when that happens, this will cause the component to re-render, and that's why we get map state to props running and then the rendering of that functional component with that count of 8. Now, if we go here and we click on, let's clear that out. If we click on this, what happens? Well, the click event happened, and so that's that console log. And then what we do is, in the counter, so there's the console log. We create an action, and then we dispatch it. So we create an action, and then we dispatch it. And that goes to the store. All right, so this right here, this dispatch is something that comes from Redux. This isn't something we built. We're dispatching the action, and what it does is it sends that to the store. And so that jumps to right here. So this is our reducer running. So we clicked, and the reducer is now running our action of type increment. So now we're going to go and say, okay, do we want to handle this action? So we're going to switch on action.type and say, okay, increment, yes, we do have a case for that. And so take the state as it is and create a new object based on it, and override the count value that's currently in state with whatever this is. And in this case, it's count plus 1. And so this gives us a brand new object with a value of 9 in the count, which is why the map state to prop says 9 right there, and then we re-render. So clicked, run the reducer, re-render. How's that look in the diagram? We clicked here, it created an action, it dispatched the action, it run the reducer in the store, and because there was a new state, the component re-rendered, and that's the entire flow. Alright, so that is a basic minimalist React Redux flow. There's more to get to, but this is about the bare bones of what you can do and actually have something functional with Redux and React.